Hello and welcome. My name is Louise Peterson. I'm with the Outdoor Recreation Council and I'm the host for this webinar. I'm joining you from Revelstoke, where we've had thunder and lightning just a minute ago. And I'd like to acknowledge and honor that that the four nations on whose traditional land I live, learn and play the Sinaiaks, the Tunaha, the Secwepemc, and the Silks. I should quickly just let you know, in case you haven't already noticed, that we are recording this session and we'll be sending out the recording in the next day or so. And you'll be getting a link to that. And also just letting you know that feel free, if you already have some questions for Kevin and Del, feel free to just put those into the is it the Q&A box, Erin? Yeah, so just put them in there. We'll also be checking the chat box if you want to put them in there. I'll be reminding you a little later as well. Okay, well, the Outdoor Recreation Council, for those of you who are not familiar with who we are a charitable organization, and we're composed of around 60 organizational members that represent the broad and diverse spectrum of outdoor recreation user groups in BC, including paddlers, hikers, mountain bikers, snowmobilers, equestrians, quad riders, sport fishers, and nature interests. And our vision is that recreation and outdoor places are valued as essential to healthy individuals and vibrant communities, and that every British Columbian has access to meaningful outdoor recreation experiences. We work to promote and advocate for access to and the responsible use of BC's outdoors for public recreation. We build bridges between outdoor recreation groups, and we represent the broad interests of this community to government and to industry. And if you're not already a member of the Outdoor Recreation Council, I strongly encourage you to consider joining us. So I am very thrilled to see that we've got so many people here today. We had around 100 people register, so they might join us. The rest might join us a little later on. But I'm thrilled to see that so many people have joined us. Because obviously you are not just keen to participate in outdoor recreation, but you also have a keen interest in how outdoor recreation is managed and planned. So I think it would be really interesting for all of us to know who is in this room. So maybe let's just kind of start with them. So yeah, before I introduce the presenters and the webinar, it would be interesting just if you could all let us know where you're calling in from and if you are part of an organization, or could also be a government agency. And I think that would be interesting for everybody. So maybe put that in the chat box, because I think everybody can see that, just to sort of help us all get to know each other a little bit. So we'll just take a minute just to do that. Hi, Monica. Oh, this is so exciting to see who's joining. We got Donegal from the Snowmobile Federation. That's great to see you. Robin, who is one of the first EDs of the Outdoor Recreation Council. Oh, this is wonderful. Laura from Penticton. Lots of friends here. Chuck from the BC Wildlife Federation. Thank you, Chuck, for joining us. Brian Farquhar, who's on the Provincial Trails Advisory Body with me and a bunch of other people who are probably here. Yeah, so make sure that you select that all attendees can see as well, because I think some of these are only visible to me. Oh, Jeff and Karen are from Goldbridge. That's great. Okay, so I think we've got people from pretty much all over the province. That's good to see, and all types of outdoor recreation user groups, even Scouts Canada. That's great. You should consider joining us. We don't have you on our list. Yeah, so feel free to continue to tell us, where you're joining us from, or where you're joining from, and which organization you're part of. But I will just get started here in the interest of time. So nature enjoyment and recreation on BC's public lands outside of the provincial park system is important to the majority of British Columbians, and it also supports a thriving $22 billion tourism industry. The Forest Practices Board has received many concerns and complaints from groups and organizations, and I think many of you are actually here today, about how recreation resources are managed under the Forest and Range Practices Act. A number of years ago, the board launched an investigation, and last week they finally released a special report that outlines what they found along with their recommendations. So I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Kevin Kriese. Sorry, Kevin, I was Googling how to pronounce your last name. Is it Kriese? Kriese? I think it's Kriese, right? Good.
Got it.
So Kevin was appointed chair of the Forest Practices Board in August 2018. He has a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from UBC and a master's degree in Natural Resource Management from SFU. Kevin entered into the public service in 1992 and has worked in different organizations before becoming Assistant Deputy Minister for the Northern Area for the Ministry of Forest, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development from 2010 to 2018. And for the past 25 years, he has lived in Smithers, where he enjoys cross-country skiing, mountain biking, hunting, and just hanging around the beautiful Bulkley Valley. I understand. And we've also got Del Williams, who's also here from the Forest Practices Board, and will definitely help answer any questions later on. Del lives near Falkland, BC. He's a semi-retired forester and has lived and worked around the province, including Revelstoke, Haida Gwaii, Victoria, Smithers, and Hazelton. He mentioned to me that his most memorable jobs were with the Revelstoke Community Forest Corporation and later with the Forest Practices Board. And he now does a bit of forestry consulting work, including working with Glenn Pilling. That's, some of us know him and the team at the Forest Practices Board on the Forest Recreation Report. And just lastly, I'll just point out that we've got Erin here too, Erin Nomando, who's our Communications and Membership Engagement Officer, and she'll help me moderate the Q&A after Kevin's presentation. So Kevin, over to you.
Great, and thank you, Louise, and thank you everybody for your time. I'm super excited to have a chance to present our report. And as part of the intros, I also want to, you mentioned Glenn Pilling, I want to recognize Glenn's work on this report. He recently retired, but he was one of the lead authors along with Del of this investigation. And if he's not online here tonight, he's probably out mountain biking. So I'm going to share my screen, make sure, there we go. So I will basically, just tell me, Louise, that's working?
Oh, perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
This will probably take about 15, 20 minutes, and I want to basically cover a bit of the history of the board, what we do, so people understand the kind of scope of our reports, as well as we'll cover the key findings, like what did we dig into and what did we find. It'll take a little bit to explain the structure of FERPA and so on, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. Obviously, this is going to be a summary. The report goes into it in significantly more detail. So I hope this is a teaser for people to read the full report if you're interested. So first, I'm going to come back. We're going to cover the mandate of the board, history of the report, the findings. Very briefly, the board is made up of 5 part-time board members. I noted in the little column that Mike Nash is on from Prince George, who's a former board member. There's a full-time chair, myself, and we have 19 staff who essentially do the investigations. And our mission is that we are the independent watchdog for sound forest and range practices in BC, and our mandate is provided in legislation under the Forest and Range Practices Act. This is a brief summary of what we do. A lot of our work is focused on audits of forest licensees, where we essentially look at how well they are meeting the Forest Practices Code, and you will sometimes see those reports come out in an area where we've audited a licensee and we assess their compliance with legislation. That's a big chunk of our work. We also do complaint investigations. We have to investigate complaints by the public about compliance with the legislation. And this is, as Louise mentioned, often we receive complaints from people who are concerned that the logging that they're seeing or they're hearing about doesn't meet the legal requirements. And that's something that they can come to us and investigate whether or not it actually is compliant. And one thing I want to make sure we talk about is that the board has a long-standing philosophy of trying to be constructive, trying to find improvements, not assigning blame, and trying to resolve complaints where we can. So it's not just about saying who's wrong and a gotcha moment. The real goal for us is to improve forest practices by finding constructive solutions. The part we're going to talk about today is one of what we call our special reports, where the board can either undertake special investigations about issues related to forest and range practices or the Wildfire Act or government enforcement. And these are really where we look at the big picture. We look at policy, we look at practices across a broad area, or we can make special reports, which this particular project is about, where we look at systemic issues that go beyond compliance, where we look at the monitoring and the systems that surround forest practices. So that's kind of the legal opportunity that we have to look into issues like we're going to talk about today. So the history of the recreation report was initiated back in actually might even be 2017, it was 2018 formally, by the previous chair and the previous board prior to my time. And in the past, the board had heard lots of complaints about recreation. It was one of the top handful of packages of issues that we get complaints about, but we had never looked at the system of recreation itself. So that became the impetus for doing a report on recreation. The actual work itself started with interviews in about 2018. And right about that time, we got a slew of complaints into our world. And because we must deal with complaints, we had to put the special report on recreation on the back burner for a while, because we simply didn't have the people. With a small staff, we have to deal with complaints first. So we essentially had to get on with that. But we brought the work back into focus late last year. And with Dell and Glenn's attention dedicated to this, we were able to complete that report in 2021. So I'm going to get a little bit into, I don't want to call it arcane, but into the legalities, the structure that FERPA exists under, because that's kind of a big part of what we looked at. And just to basically explain what's known as the Pillars of FERPA. So this picture on the right is a very simplified overview of how the various parts of the Forest and Range Practices Act come together and are supposed to operate as a system. So you have the objectives pillar, where there are 11 FERPA values. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And there are essentially either objective statements for each of those values or the plan and practice requirements for those. There are also compliance and enforcement over here on the right, professional reliance underneath, and the Forest and Range Evaluation Program, which looks at monitoring them. So for this report, we didn't really look into C&E. We have another report on C&E. We have a specific report on the Forest and Range Evaluation Program. So if you're interested in those, we touch on them very briefly in this report, but they weren't central. But we do have other special reports that directly look at those pillars of FERPA. If you're interested, go to our website. But the key ones that really were central to this particular one is the objective side and the plan side. So we're going to come back to this Pillars of FERPA later in the presentation, but it gives you kind of a conceptual model of how FERPA fits together. So I mentioned recreation values under FERPA. So this picture is essentially a list of the 11 values of FERPA in the left-hand column, and you can see them there, from soils, visual quality, all the way down to recreation resources, resource features, and cultural heritage resources. So for each of those values, we listed on the right, is there an objective that describes what those values should, or how those values should be managed, what should be achieved on the land base? And down the right, you'll see that for all of the values, except for 2, there is a provincial objective that basically then instructs licensees that they must produce a resultant strategy. That resultant strategy in their forest stewardship plan then becomes legally binding, and they have to essentially implement it on the ground. So an example would be for soils, there's a requirement, an objective that they must not disturb soils, to oversimplify it. And there are practice requirements that basically describe the limits of soil disturbance, and there's a whole series of procedures that follow it. So you have a body of clarity that around soils that emanates from a FERPA value with a legal objective and a whole bunch of stuff that lands after that lets you essentially enforce that value through forest stewardship plans and right down to the ground. So one of the first things to note is that recreation is one of only two FERPA values that does not have a provincial objective, and we'll come back to that. Other couple parts about FERPA and recreation resources, and this oversimplifies it, but there's a couple sections in the legislation that are described in more detail in the report that are relevant, and there's also a series of regulations that apply. But to oversimplify it, you have section 56 and 57 that essentially enables the management of recreation sites and trails. You have section 118, many of you will be familiar with. That's what enables the government to enter into partnership agreements. And then you have section 58 that essentially allows the province to establish objectives and rules for managing conflicting uses. So you have site level management, you have partnership approaches, essentially enabling people to contract into managing areas. And then you have this other piece of legislation, section 58, that is about managing the broader land base for conflicting uses. And there's a couple other parts that are relevant that are explained in the report, but it gives you a sense of the range of tools that exist in FERPA to manage recreation. So that was a really quick blast over the legislation. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I don't think it's central to our findings. But again, if you have a lot of questions about that, we could talk about those during the Q&A session. But we'll talk about then how we evaluated how well that set of legislation works for recreation resource. So the findings that we're going to jump into now are essentially based on our assessment of the legislation, along with our experience in various reports, and also based on the interviews that the staff conducted. So one of our first finding is around the issues related to government staffing. Many of you be aware of this. That first, the mandate of those staff and of the organization, Rec Sites and Trails BC, is focused on sites and trails, which is their name. And that the staffing effort is already stretched for this part of their mandate. So they, with the growing number of recreation sites, I think there's 100 new sites and trails established every year in BC. There's a pile of work to maintain and manage that current infrastructure on sites and trails. But here's the kicker. That mandate and staffing issue means there is very little capacity available for managing recreation on the broader land base beyond sites and trails. So this next slide is thanks to Dell. He created a little animated slide when they presented this to the board and wanted to make this point about the difference between sites and trails and broader recreational land base. So this is up in Dell's old stomping grounds in the Revelstoke country. And what you can see on here is some established, these are recreation sites, I believe, Del. And then what we add in is some cabins, again, site-based, and there's some backcountry skiing and some recreation. I think these are designated trails in this stuff. And then you start bringing in all the other uses that occur on the land base that are not managed on a recreation site or potentially not on a trail. And it starts to get busier. So you've got all sorts of recreation uses now on the broader land base, many of which are outside of an established recreation site or trail, and many of which the land base is actually really essential in terms of being managed for them. So you've got river rafting and all sorts of other activities. So this picture, we'll go back, starts to paint you a much more complex picture of how recreation use occurs across the land base compared to a picture that only includes recreation sites and trails. So that's a key message. Another finding, which will not be a surprise to most folks, is that there continue to be concerns about the impacts of timber harvesting on recreation. In particular, is the harvesting appropriate? Is it disturbing the experience? Is it disturbing recreation infrastructure like a trail or a site or something else? Is it disturbing visual values and so on? So there's a significant level of concern that we heard. I want to say that we've also seen lots of places where it's well managed, but it remains a concern. Also, what we heard, and certainly from the licensees, is that it's also an issue for them that they often have to manage and have impact on timber and on their operational needs by accommodating recreation resources. So there are two sides to that coin. But the last point is that generally the focus of most of the forestry side of things from timber harvesting is mitigating or managing the impact of that harvest on those designated sites and trails. And that's because those are known, they're established, they're legal, and therefore they become the focus of what forest companies think about and focus on during their planning. Not exclusively, but they are the dominant issue, and not thinking about the broader recreation resource on that broader landscape. And another finding, this will be no surprise, access management is a hot topic from many perspectives in BC, related to whether it's water and the impacts of access on water quality, or the impacts of access on fish wildlife resources. But in recreation, that access is also a concern. It enables recreation. It also can negatively impact recreation. If you're more of a remote recreation resource value, adding access is problematic. If you're a eroded recreation resource value, then taking it away can be problematic. And a lot of this is about, there are conflicting demands, but there's also a need to be more proactive in the planning around where access should and should not go. So that whole issue of when companies deactivate a road, which they are required to do under the legislation, how do they take into consideration the impacts of that on recreation users? Our next finding is user group conflicts. Again, this is just an ongoing thing in BC. People have different needs for the recreation resource on the same land base, and that often results in conflicts, whether that's conflicts between simple conflicts between mountain bikers and horseback riders, or whether it's more complex conflicts like the conflicts between different types of skiers or skiers and sledders and those kinds of pieces. But often we heard about the need to better manage user group conflicts on the extended land base. And finally, we heard a lot about recreation planning and what I'll call sort of gaps in recreation planning. First, the inventories and information available for recreation planning have become fairly stale. There was a lot of money spent in the late 90s on recreation inventories, and those programs and dollars essentially disappeared. So there has been some pieces of the information base updated, but it's relatively limited. So we've gotten behind on that. Strategic land use planning in the first round of land use plans, LRMPs or core land use plans, often had a fair bit of focus on addressing recreation interests. And of course, there has been very little planning for almost 20 years. So there's a lot of these plans are outdated and stale. And then specifically to recreation, that whole objective idea that we talked about under the Pillars of Ferpa, for recreation sites, there is a legal provision to allow objectives to be established. About half the sites in the province actually have established objectives, and many of them were established actually under the code or the very early days of Ferpa. And that means they're often outdated, poorly written, done in the early days. They weren't as effective as you would get. So we actually find that while sites and trails are often established, those objectives aren't present at all, or aren't written in such a way that they can give really good guidance to forest harvesting or to other uses. So they're not as useful as they could be. So back to our findings, when you look at FERPA, in the board's opinion, the legal structure is actually pretty reasonable. Some people will disagree with whether it's perfect or not, but it has a pretty decent legal structure. All the parts are there. It is, I think, in our opinion, an objective-based model can be very effective when it's applied properly, and inflexible and hard to administer and all those kinds of things. So we think the structure is pretty decent and applied. So in particular, the gaps in objectives. So FERPA is based on having good objectives. The gaps in inventories and information. If they're out of date, how do you make sense of where recreation resources are? In addition, the public input to the management of FERPA is fairly limited. Up until recently, there was no requirement to see cut blocks and roads. There is a change to FERPA that will be coming into force, we believe, shortly, that will require a mandatory review and comment on blocks and roads, which is a great move ahead. But there's still limited places in that world where recreation resource values can be brought into the planning process. And in particular, there is no cohesive planning layer for where recreation resources are considered proactively. So based on those, the board identified 3 recommendations or opportunities for improvement. The first is improve the information available on recreation resources. The second is improve the use of objectives for managing the recreation resource value. And the third is incorporate recreation resource values into strategic and tactical planning processes. So this is a cool diagram that Dell also made up, which go back to that FERPA framework as it was intended to be. And what the report found is that the objectives pillar is pretty skinny. So it's supposed to be wide and strong, and in fact, it is relatively thin because it just hasn't been used. Second is that there's other weaknesses in the FERPA framework around, there's very little monitoring, the information isn't all that clear. So this is where your FERPA framework starts to look pretty weak. So I thought that was a pretty funny picture. It's called the crumbling pillars of FERPA. So I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about it in our report, taking advantage of emerging planning opportunities. So many of you will be aware that the province has committed to modernizing land use planning, and there are now actually planning processes being initiated, I think in 10 or 11 different parts of the province, usually in partnership with First Nations. And so you will start to see slowly a reevaluating and rebooting of strategic land use planning processes. So that's a huge opportunity. The second thing is that there is, at least notionally, the province has indicated it's interested in bringing in a new planning level to the Forest and Range Practices Act called Forest Landscape Planning. The board put out a report about 2 years ago where we called for what's called tactical planning. It's essentially the same thing. And in that, it's one level below strategic planning, where you essentially try and figure out more at the landscape or watershed level, how will we harvest while managing these other values, but taking a much longer term look at the harvesting. So looking out 20, 40, 50 years, looking at things like, should we road this area, and then potentially, are we going to deactivate it over the medium or long term? Looking at things like designing your harvest systems more proactively, and then being able to figure out what that impact that has. Like if we harvested in these kinds of patterns, what would the impact on visual quality be if we harvested at this rate and pace as opposed to that rate and pace? So there is a huge opportunity if the government promises or fulfills its commitment to bring in forest landscape planning, to bring the recreation resource value into that process. So I want to make sure people are aware that's one of the things that we pointed to in this report, is taking advantage of that opportunity. And I think that's where we're going to end. So I'll just summarize. I also want to just maybe make a couple of comments. We tried to be as constructive and I think complimentary as we can. I think the feedback was that Rec Sites and Trail as an organization actually is doing a pretty good job with limited resources. Lots of places where people would like to see it improved, and you can always sort of evaluate that there's areas for improvement. But I think the feedback overall was there's some really good strengths in that program. The real gap is this lack of planning, lack of consideration of recreation resources proactively so that companies can manage around them with clarity through objectives, and the lack of a planning layer for recreation resources on the broader land base. So we're hoping that our recommendations, stimulate a conversation with folks like you and with folks in the provincial government about, are there opportunities to enhance recreation by filling in those gaps? So we'll open it up.
Great. Well, thank you, Kevin, and Del for the beautiful graphics. I think this is a really good overview of some of the key points in the document, and definitely to everybody out there who has not who hasn't had a chance to kind of look at it yet, to make sure you do and take your time, grab a cup of coffee. So please let us know if you've got any questions. We have definitely got lots of time to take questions now. Maybe while those are coming in, maybe I'll just ask Kevin, so have you presented your recommendations to government yet, and how have they been received?
So we have presented the report to the ministry, and we have not heard back. Now, back to our legal side, we have not asked for a response back because we don't have the power to compel a response, but we'll be in touch with government in the next couple months and say, so what do you think? But we haven't heard back formally yet.
Thanks, CL, for sharing the presentation or the report. Okay, maybe let's see. So
we have a few questions in the Q&A box there.
So should I read it up, Kevin, or do you want to take a look?
Sure. I can start. Like, you want me to maybe I'll just go through and
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, one question is about recreation on marine islands. So I'm pretty, Del, if you know, I think that the recreation FERPA mandate stops at high water mark, I think is the simple answer.
Yes,
so
that's right.
It's not a FERPA recreation management, but I will say, putting on my old hat, there are tools under the Land Act where the province could potentially do some zoning. There have been marine use plans on parts of the province which are enabled under the Land Act. So there would be some possibility there, but it may not be as robust. But this was focused on above high water mark. Question about the mandate letter. Basically asking whether or not the mandate letter is sort of instrumental in managing recreation values and conservation values. I think the answer is certainly mandates drive the bureaucracy to the top priorities of where they're going to focus their energy in terms of change. And you see that, the mandates the current minister around reconciliation and modernizing legislation and so on. But one thing I'll say is that inside that mandate letter is a directive to the Minister Conroy to update the Forest and Range Practices Act. And so I think there is inside that an opportunity to sort of include recreation changes as part of that mandate commitment.
There's one here. Sorry, I can't see who it's. Oh, Freddie, sorry. I presume your entire presentation is based on your mandate as pertaining to public lands. On Vancouver Island, much of the once public land is now in private hands of mosaic, etc. As a result, much of the access of prior times is now closed behind gates. Whatever happened to initiatives such as right to roam, public access to private lands?
I don't know. I do know, because it's close to our mandate, is there was a review of the private forest management land regulation that was initiated about 2 years ago, and that review has not been fully received. So I think there was a process underway to review that regulation, which does cover most of those private lands, but I don't know about right to roam. One question is, what's the average turnaround time for a Section 57 application? I have no idea. Del, do you have any, did we hear anything about that?
We did hear concerns about that, that they're taking a long time, but they're in defense of recreation sites and trails, there's a lot of steps they have to go through legally, the consultation, etc. So it does take some time.
So there's one here from Richie Leslie. Oh, the other point I have, oh, maybe you had another point before this one, but I just see this one. The other point I have is that I've seen a huge regional variation in the consistency of rec sites and trail species services. The operations in the Okanagan and Monashis are under particular stress as their population is growing very quickly and now exceeds more than 400,000 people. In the valley, many trails and crown lands surrounding the valley that have been used for 20 plus years are still undesignated.
Excellent point. I think two things I would observe that we have heard. One is that in the busy places where recreation is expanding, the pressure on the program is really significant, whether that's sea to sky or some of the areas in the busy, and the demand to create new trails, designate them, manage them is just skyrocketing. And this is an organization who hasn't had new staff. So they've got to manage their old infrastructure, their old resources, and as Del mentioned, in a much more complicated world, the duty today to establish a recreation site or trail is massively more complex than the duty that existed 10 years ago, because we have really upped the game in the province around consultation and engagement with First Nations in how we assess impact on other resources. So things like recreation trails could affect habitat. So how do you pay attention to that? So it's harder. And I think this is really the signal. I don't think the signal that's going to stop, that increase in complexity, that the growth that we're seeing in recreation, all the signals are that's going to keep coming. So there's a program already under stress, already struggling to keep its current assets, and then you got this other stuff on top of it. So it really does come back to the stress on the size of the organization for the pressure that's put on them.
Yeah, Donegal is saying in terms of the section 50, what are we talking about, 56 applications, 3 to 5 years is the best case. I was just echoing that rec sites and trails doesn't have the capacity to manage more.
I have a few good questions here in the
good.
Q&A chat box. First question, are you aware of how many First Nations have recreation in their land use plans?
So we have not looked at that comprehensively. I will say that I have been involved in a number of First Nation land use plans, and some of them have a bit, but it's definitely, it varies. It varies across different First Nations. I will say that where the province has done joint planning with First Nations, there's often a big emphasis on trying to come to terms with what is the right level and tone for jointly managing or the shared vision for recreation resources. So I was involved in the Sea to Sky land use plan. I was the negotiator there, and there was an enormous emphasis in those agreements about where do we want to encourage or discourage or use tools to manage recreation, and that was done in partnership with the First Nations. But I think it's very variable across the province where First Nations have emphasized the recreation value or not.
Do you have another good one, Erin? Otherwise,
yeah, I have a few here. A question from Sarah about the impact of this report. Is it mostly making recommendations to government, or is this also being sent to and or being targeted to forest companies?
Yeah, so we report to the public, which primarily means we go to the minister and anyone else who will listen. The policy, the recommendations that we're providing here would not directly affect industry, but if they were implemented, it would create tools that would affect industry. So we would expect they would be part of the conversation, but essentially they're downstream. But I will say one thing we tried to do with this report is not to say, I think in some of these things, particularly improving planning and improving inventories, government won't be able to carry the freight entirely on its own for that future if you look at the complexity. So the idea of a shared stewardship ethic, where a lot of other players, we talked about First Nations, they're much more involved in land use planning matters and so on. Certainly many of the organizations that are on ORC, I think, have in the past played major roles in helping planning move ahead, being constructive allies in planning, building inventories, building information bases. So I think that really we're trying to start a conversation about who are the various partners, with government as a central part, but not the only part that could advance these recommendations.
Thank you. Another question here. What objective do you think could be added to FERPA to protect recreation values, and what would the process to adding an objective be?
Okay.
There's some good questions.
Help us write it. What does it say?
This is writing a provincial objective for FERPA is tricky. And I'll go by way of example. When you get something very simple like a bridge, you can write a provincial objective that says the bridge must be safe and sound. And that's going to be the same thing everywhere. Recreation is harder to write provincially because the objective for recreation in one place might be very different than it is somewhere else, because it's very site specific and it's very unique to the uses. So we actually talked about this and had a hard time defining exactly what a provincial recreation objective should be. Other than maybe where recreation resources exist, you need to write a strategy around them. So it's kind of more of a procedural type objective, but we didn't go too far down that. But in our report, we did draw attention to where I think there may be more fruitful ground, which is that local objective setting kind of model, where you can get clear that the recreation feature or value is X, and therefore what you need to achieve, company Q or licensees as a whole, is Y. So for example, if the recreation feature is rock climbing, and you've got this really cool rock climbing area, you can write an objective that says it's all about access, it's about visuals, it's about not disturbing the trees surrounding it. Like, you can be really clear, maintain the integrity of this kind of feature. So I would say we didn't dismiss the idea, and I think we put it in there because it still needs more work. But you'd have to work pretty hard to figure out a provincial recreation objective that actually functions. But I can certainly see lots of examples locally where it really becomes pretty effective. Del, do you want to add any color to that? Because we had a pretty good discussion when we were debating the report. So.
Yes, and it is provincial level objectives for most of the FERPA values are difficult to write because you have to be general, and you can't just because of the broad nature, as Kevin was saying. That being said, there are some ways to get around it. It can be something along the lines of don't render ineffective a recreation value, and then that would enable licensees, forest licensees, to put an objective or create a result or strategy for that objective in their forest stewardship plans. So that's a provincial level. And then right now there are lots of recreation sites in the province, and yeah, many of these have objectives, and they're quite specific. They can be quite specific and nail down be quite effective for the values on those particular sites. And then, as you're alluding to, Kevin, there's kind of this middle ground where we don't really have objectives yet. It's kind of broader than sites, but narrower than provincial level.
Yeah. But maybe to finish that, I think this is an area that would be really exciting to explore some of the models more deeply. If people believe that the objective setting is kind of a gap, we've pointed it out. It would take some more policy work, maybe some pilot projects to sort of say, well, what could it look like in this area, and try it out. Because there's nothing like it to say, gee, we tried it and this worked and that didn't, before you go and export it across the rest of the province, and find those efficient models that really help improve things.
Okay. There's a lot of good questions here. There's one from Leon. Where did I see that? Some of our section 57s are intended to become section 56. How does a timber harvester being flagged about these intentions?
Del, that's yours.
Okay, how are
So
our
57s.
licensees being flagged about these issues? Well, when there is a recreation site, it's in the maps. It's all on the provincial database, so it's there, and so it's kind of open information. And for designated recreation sites, before there's any kind of industrial operation in those sites, then the forest licensee has to pass that by the recreation officer. So that's where the interactions take place. One of the problems with that is recreation sites are often very small. So legally, it's the operations within a recreation site that require permission from the recreation officer. However, most licensees, in my experience and in my time as a forest licensee, you kind of try and pay attention to the surroundings as well, but there is no legal requirement to do so.
I know, but I need to come in, so I can get my clothes.
Erin, do you have any that we should bring up or that we should bring forward? I think we probably got maybe 10 more minutes, Kevin and Bill. Because we probably could. I'm sure there's still quite a few here in the chat that I could also read up. Erin, I'll.
Yep, I have one here. So does the report speak to issues that can arise when recreation infrastructure crosses jurisdictional boundaries? So such as rec sites and trails BC, trails crossing into parks or municipal land, for example?
Not directly, but I will say indirectly, that's the kind of thing you can deal with a planning process, right? Because you would often integrate across planning boundaries if you did an LRMP or something like that. It would include a bunch of the multiple jurisdictions and so on, but I don't think we directly addressed that integration between different jurisdictions.
No, we didn't really deal with that.
Yeah, had enough to handle with the 80% of the province.
We did come up, well, there was a lot of issues that came up when we were interviewing people, and we kind of ranked the issues that were big, and that one didn't hit. We didn't hear about that one too much, but I can see it locally being a problem.
So there's one here too about jurisdiction. Do you have any jurisdiction in regard to city actions that negatively impact recreation? Oh, not you, but does the province, or this rec sites and trails, national forest?
City?
Yeah.
Meaning like municipal?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. That's a great question.
No.
Unless the activity occurs on Crown land, I don't think the province has jurisdiction to manage it. But I'm just, yeah.
That's okay.
I'm thinking, Del, the conflicting uses piece, they just have to figure out whether or not, let's say, a conflicting recreation use occurred on private land in a municipality. There's no authority there. You have to be on Crown land.
Yeah, well, interestingly, I have a woodlot license near Revelstoke, and the municipal boundaries cross into the woodlot license area on one corner. technically there would be some interactions there, but it hasn't reared itself in my experience.
Yeah, I will just add sort of as a broad commentary about jurisdictional boundaries. BC's actually got some of the simplest jurisdictional challenges in North America because we're mostly provincial crown land. Use that term, crown. Other places have lots of state, federal, municipal, private. Private makes up a way bigger portion. And so what they tend to do is create these collaboratives where, particularly for ecosystem management, water management, and so on, where you have to essentially incent multiple jurisdictions to cooperate across boundaries with large shared goals. So that's really big in the States because of the fractal, lots of jurisdictional challenges. You have to kind of scale up to that. But we have a lot simpler world and haven't got to that point where we formalize those kind of things. They just rely on good neighbors working across fences, essentially.
Well, maybe I'll just bring this one up. It's in the chat box. Several rec sites in the Lower Mainland, and I think this applies to other places too, have access blocked by gates. Stadler comes to mind. This is from Mary Austin, I think. Large areas are closed off, forcing hikers to climb through cut blocks to reach the sites. If it's to keep the public out of work areas, what about having these gates opened on weekends to allow recreational access? Is that something that you can speak to?
So that comes right back to our access management. I don't know the specifics, but I can imagine there are many gates on Crown land. They're usually installed to protect an ecosystem feature of some type. So they're usually there for environmental protection reasons. And that can conflict with the recreation values. So that just comes back, you need good planning before you install gates to make sure it's done in the right, is it the right time, is it the right decision? And then if it's done right, do you have things like mitigating opportunities? I do know from my past time in the province really actually hates gates because of the complexity of managing them, who gets the key and why are some people behind there and I'm not allowed. So gates are actually a really, really, frankly, bad solution from a management perspective because they're an enormous headache, very time consuming. So they're kind of not much in favor for all those reasons. But it just comes back to access planning and having good planning that's clear and fair and thorough and has good transparency around it.
So I don't think there's any more in the chat box. Erin, do you have one or two more in the Q&A area?
Yes, I have a question here from Wayne. If there was a reasoning behind recommending more planning but not recommending some sort of execution of the plans?
When we recommend planning, I guess we're recommending a planning system, which would include implementation. So I think it's just implied that when you do planning, we're talking about planning with all of its attributes, including a process to implement them.
Is another one, Erin?
Yes, I think so. So do the exploratory models include separation of plan formation from execution? For example, plans formed and regulatory approvals with local user groups and then executed by a local collaborating user groups under regulatory supervision?
Oh boy, I mean, those are great questions. And I think those are essentially brainstorming what I think some of the future solutions will need to be. I mean, I will say, and just come back to planning in BC, we have big gaps in the planning system because planning was essentially abandoned for about 15 years. There was gaps in implementation. There was some implementation. I don't think we want to be wholly dismissal of it. There were many efforts, but it wasn't far enough. People see more holes, I think, than they saw some of the progress. And so I think going forward, as BC is now recommitted to a planning paradigm, it's going to have a lot of work to do to fill those pieces in. And from our perspective, where's the monitoring? Because you don't just plan and leave it. You have to plan and see, are you achieving the objectives you set out? You need to be prepared to revisit your plans. And some of these ideas we put together are kind of complicated. So the point, you're probably going to have to bring in implementation arrangements that says, look, who's going to help us do these kinds of activities? Who's accountable? Who's responsible? What are the bodies that could actually do that work? So I think there's a lot of work in BC to upgrade the planning system to meet its promise. And those are some of the things that I think are going to come up.
Okay, Erin, maybe just a couple more.
Yeah, I have a good one here from CL. Can you share maybe perhaps some of the case studies that show some of the issues with FERPA and the value of recreation? Anything maybe that comes to mind?
Del, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. We specifically, well, when we started this project, it was going to be in two parts. One with a kind of a written report based on office work and interviews, and then going on to more details on case studies. But we found that we had, after doing the first part of the work, we had enough information to produce this report, which we thought was quite valuable. So we haven't stepped into specific case studies yet. However, Glenn and I found quite a few good examples of how things were working around the province within FERPA. And one that comes to mind right away is the Shushwa Trails Alliance, where local group was formed that involves First Nations, hikers. It's a broad kind of amalgamation of user groups who have got together, and they work with government on solutions, and that's, yeah. And that also speaks to I saw another question here about from Freddie.
Sorry, Del.
In the Chilliwack area, with with local groups working with the district, the forest district there, and they've been making great inroads on problems with forest recreation management.
Yeah, one thing maybe I'll add to that too is that I think we'll start to see some emerging examples. I'm going to pay close attention to this project they're doing in the Sea to Sky to try and deal with the conflicts. There's some, long-term planning in that area that they're trying to tackle. And they're bringing in some external resources. They're bringing in some enhanced ministry resources. They're going to bring in some enhanced tools. And of course, the Sea to Sky is just that crucible of so much going on. But I think they're going to try and tackle this broader planning on the land base in a way that we haven't seen in many places. So that would be one I would pay attention to.
What process is that, Kevin?
Well, they've got it came out of some land management tools that they were trying to implement, and they've got sort of a conflict resolution process, and then it's leading to something resembling a land use plan. I don't know if they're calling it a land use plan yet or not, but that's where it's likely headed, is something to basically clarify where are we going to go and where will the additional trail sites pressures be. So I think it's emergent, but it's going to be something to pay attention to.
Okay, we are at 6 o'clock now. I think there might still be like a couple of questions, but I think maybe we need to kind of leave it at that. I think you've answered like the vast majority of all the questions that were put forward. So yeah, I think we should just say thank you, Kevin and Del, and for joining us today and presenting on the new report. And there was something in the chat, like there's a link to the report that to the recreation report. You can find it on your website as well. Yeah, thank you to everybody who joined us today. And I know that there was the ORC will definitely be providing some input once we've had a good chance to read and digest and discuss your report. We'll be putting something forward to the Ministry of Forests. Yeah, so thanks. Like, feel free if any of you still have some outstanding questions, like feel free to email info@orcbc.ca, and we'll, if we can't answer it, we'll make sure that we ask Kevin and Del to weigh in. So yeah, thank you. We'll send the recording. We're still recording, yeah. So we'll send the recording to you in the next couple of days. Anything else from you, Del and Kevin, before we close?
Well, I'll say, some of you folks, if you want to carry on further a conversation about exploring this, please contact me. Our information's on the board. We're happy to follow up. Some of your groups might want a more detailed follow-up on the report to explore it some more. There's been a pretty high-level overview, and I also want to say we recognize there's lots of issues around recreation that we didn't touch in this report. This was really looking at the FERPA framework and that part of it. There's a whole bunch of other things that go on recreation that are also important and part of the puzzle. But we'd be happy to, you know, follow up with any people who are interested. Just give me a shout.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks everybody, and yeah, we'll be sending out some notifications about our next webinars. I'm hoping to do something on the modernized land use planning, so hopefully we'll be able to kind of share some more info with you on that very soon, some dates. Yeah, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Okay, bye bye.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.